Benny Siegel, better known as Bugsy, was tall, good-looking, and charismatic, a charmer and a womanizer. He was also a gangster and a killer. He was a man with enemies. Late one June evening in 1947, he arrived at the Los Angeles home of his mistress with a friend. Siegel's mistress was away, and the two men made themselves at home. As with most mob killings, the murder of Bugsy Siegel was never solved. But the one name always associated with Siegel's death is the one name he would have least expected, that of his best friend, Meyer Lansky. Meyer Lansky was one of the most mysterious of all mob figures.
Little Meyer, quite tough, but not really a violent man.
For some, he was the Jewish mastermind behind the Mafia, pulling the strings from the shadows.
He was a financial genius of organized crime. He was also a killer, part of the New York Mafia, and very powerful and very successful.
But for others, he was little more than a middle manager for the mob. His sinister reputation, the product of media hype and hysteria.
The cold, hard evidence suggests that he wasn't quite the business brains that everybody thought he was, or that he thought he was himself.
Mob mastermind, or victim of his own legend. We unravel the enigma of Meyer Lansky. Meyer Lansky arrived in America in 1911 as an 8-year-old boy. He and his family were Jewish immigrants fleeing the brutal anti-Semitic pogroms of their native Russia.
He was scarred by what he saw as a small child. I think Meyer was rather focused on anti-Semitism and his belief that he is not going to lay down the way the Jews in Russia or Poland did, and the way he even felt his father did. And a lot of what Meyer felt being Jewish was not putting up with abuse and fighting back.
His family soon settled in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, New York's impoverished Jewish ghetto.
He grew up in a pretty tough district in New York. And whatever your size was, you had to be tough. You had to be able to take a beating and give a beating. And so he was small.
Just 5 feet 4 inches, Meyer Lansky quickly learned to use his fists and was soon in trouble with the law. It was at this time he'd first met another young Jewish hoodlum called Bugsy Siegel. The meeting happened when Siegel became involved in a street brawl.
Siegel had these charismatic good looks, and he got involved in a fight, a street fight, and he picked up a gun, and he was so transfixed with the fury of the fight and his anger that he raised the gun and was about to shoot somebody, and they could hear the police coming from all directions. It was only when Meyer sort of physically restrained him and pushed him away that he was able to save him. He said that was the beginning of their friendship, and that, of course, was actually the nature of their relationship.
Lansky was the brains, Siegel was the brawn. Together, the two young men formed the Jewish Bugs and Meyer gang.
You sort of get this sense that, oh, organized crime is Italian. But early in the century, the Jewish rackets were very, very powerful.
The gang stood up to the Italian and Irish toughs that came into their neighborhood to beat up Jews. They also engaged in more lucrative activities.
They were involved in what we'll call small-time criminal activities. Hijacking, loan sharking, gambling.
Lansky and Siegel's big break came in 1920 with the introduction of prohibition, the ban on the consumption of alcohol, a ban which spawned a lucrative illegal trade for mobsters of all ethnic groups.
It was prohibition that turned all of these low-level street predatory criminals into business executives because they had to figure out how to manufacture or import, distribute, sell, run real organizations.
The Bugs and Meyer gang was soon carving a niche for itself in New York's brutal gang wars. And it was at this time that Lansky made what would be the second key alliance of his life, with Italian mobster Charles Lucky Luciano, a man whose respect Lansky first earned when they were teenagers, and Luciano tried to rob him.
Famously, Luciano tried to shake him down, and Meyer told him in no uncertain terms, in very colorful language, where he could get off. You think that because I'm Jewish, I'm just going to fork over money. That's not going to happen today, buddy.
It was the start of one of the most important friendships in the history of organized crime, and of a groundbreaking Sicilian-Jewish alliance.
Luciano really didn't like the old-time Sicilian bosses, the notion that you only stick with your own. A lot of the newer, younger Italians, they didn't really care about the cultural precedent for setting up a gang. It had nothing to do with Sicily. They wanted to make money, and guys like Meyer, who were Jewish, wanted to make money.
With Lansky at his side, Luciano was soon shooting his way to the top of the New York underworld. By the summer of 1931, just one man stood between Luciano and total control: Salvatore Maranzano, a classic old-style Sicilian mob boss. Luciano turned to Lansky for help.
One of the stereotypes of the Jewish rackets is the Jewish guys handled the money and the Italian guys were the tough guys. Not true. Interestingly enough, when Luciano took over the Italian rackets, it was the Jewish muscle that played a big role.
The idea was that if you use Jewish gunmen, we get very ethnic now, if you use Jewish gunmen, the Italian criminals wouldn't be so suspicious because they wouldn't look like Italian hitmen or Sicilian hitmen.
At Luciano's bidding, Lansky organized a gang of Jewish assassins to visit Maranzano's offices on Park Avenue, posing as tax inspectors from the Inland Revenue Service.
One of the guys whose name was Red Levine, who was known for being an Orthodox Jew who would not kill on the Sabbath. But Maranzano was so bigoted that he felt if some Jewish bean counter IRS guys came to his office, they couldn't do him any harm. Well, not only did they do him harm, they killed him.
With Maranzano dead, Luciano became the king of New York and set about establishing the structures of the modern mafia. Meyer Lansky now sat at the right hand of the most powerful mobster in America. But he knew there would always be limits on his power.
Lansky could never be a leader for one reason. He could never be a member because he wasn't of Italian or Sicilian extract. He was a Jew and he knew his place. He was highly respected as somebody who had the ear of Luciano, who could talk to Luciano, and he was a great entrepreneur in criminal endeavors. But he was never a kingmaker or in a position of authority.
From now on, Lansky's role would be that of a chief executive in his various criminal enterprises. Powerful, but answerable ultimately to Sicilian bosses. By now, he'd married and quickly had 3 children, the oldest of whom, Buddy, suffered from cerebral palsy. Otherwise, life was good. He left the crowded tenements of the Lower East Side behind and took an apartment in the exclusive Majestic building, overlooking Central Park on New York's Upper West Side. With the abolition of Prohibition in 1933, he branched out into a new business, one that would dominate the rest of his life.
Meyer Lansky was brilliant mathematically, and his real interest was gambling because he had a knack for it.
Lansky was good with numbers. And the whole idea of gambling is you got to be quick with numbers, you got to know the odds.
He could tell you if it came to craps, well, the proportion for the table was 4.5, and if it was blackjack, it was 5.2.
Gambling was illegal, but widely tolerated, and Lansky was soon running casinos in New York, Florida, and a number of other states. Paradoxically, his casinos made money because they were honest.
The tables would not be fixed because he knew exactly how to take his profit without cheating anybody.
You don't have to be dishonest to win. You have to have volume. As long as you keep gambling, you'll lose.
By the end of the 1930s, Lansky's casinos had made him a wealthy man. But the little Jewish immigrant from the Lower East Side craved something more than wealth.
Right through Lansky's life, there is this wish to be respectable. And right through Lansky's life, there is this feeling that he is not a criminal, that he's a citizen like any other.
There is no doubt that the American people need an adequate merchant marine.
How did Joe Kennedy make his money? What was the foundation of the Kennedy family fortune? Joe Kennedy was a bootlegger, and he was able to launder his fortune and use it to pay his son's way to become president of the United States. Meyer Lansky literally compared himself to Joe Kennedy and felt he was no more immoral than that man had been.
He actually had a snobbish streak. This was somebody who studied history. This is somebody, when his friends were out carousing at night, would hire tutors.
Lansky sent his own second son, Paul, to study at the military academy, West Point.
He would jot down if he saw a vocabulary word that he was interested in. You can see in his handwriting, he would write about it in a book. I remember one of the things he wrote was, determine how to pronounce Thucydides.
The attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 and America's entry into the Second World War provided Lansky with an extraordinary and unexpected opportunity to prove his patriotism and win the respectability he craved. In February 1942, a large troop carrier called the Normandy caught fire and capsized in New York Harbor.
The death of a queen. Now the $60 million luxury liner lies on her side, mortally stricken.
The Navy suspected sabotage. Many of the men who worked on the docks were Italian, a nation America was now at war with. When the Navy attempted to investigate, they found the waterfront an impenetrable, closed world.
The longshoremen by nature are not the kind of guys who take well to men in uniform, government uniform, coming onto the docks and saying, "I'd like you to snitch." So Roosevelt is distraught by this. Pearl Harbor has just happened. The Navy is explaining to him, "Mr. President, we don't control the docks." And Roosevelt is, "What do you mean we don't control the docks? We're the U.S. government." "Well, Mr. President, you were governor of New York. Do you remember who ran the docks?" "Ah, okay."
At that time, the docks in New York were controlled by the mob.
The FBI and the war intelligence authorities suddenly realized the only way they were going to find out about what was going on the waterfront in New York was to actually come to terms with the so-called underworld, figures like Lucky Luciano. The trouble was, Luciano was in jail.
Luciano had been imprisoned in 1936 on charges of organizing prostitution. He was looking at a sentence of 30 to 50 years. The Navy needed a go-between. Enter Meyer Lansky, a Jew who already had impeccable anti-Nazi credentials. In the 1930s, New York's Jewish community had been threatened by the rise of the pro-Nazi German-American Bund. Jewish leaders had turned to Lansky, one of the few members of their community with the muscle to confront Nazi thugs.
The Bund found themselves under siege by Meyer's boys. Meyer and Ben Siegel, and Meyer actually personally went to some of these rallies. They would go and bust them up. They would hit them over the head with bats, and they would really terrorize these Bund members.
When the Navy approached him in 1942 to help them on the docks, Lansky immediately agreed to help. He arranged for Luciano to be moved to a more comfortable jail, closer to New York, and acted as a mediator in talks between the Navy and the Sicilian mobster.
It's an extraordinary story. Lansky says, "Can Luciano be moved?" And then you see, because there was an official inquiry into this after the war, you see the actual documents saying, "Move Luciano." Mr. Meyer Lansky is going to come up and visit him. Do not request Mr. Lansky's passport. Do not take Mr. Lansky's fingerprints.
What then resulted was a deal where Luciano could meet with his men in prison, where he hadn't been able to do that before. And yes, he gave the order to cooperate with the Navy, but he also was allowed to conduct business.
It was an extraordinary deal, and it yielded almost immediate results. In June 1942, 8 Nazi spies were arrested following a tip-off from mob-controlled fishermen, an event later trumpeted by the FBI in this publicity film, although the Mafia's role in capturing the spies was not mentioned. The following year provided the mob with an even more dramatic opportunity to lend assistance to the war effort. The invasion of Sicily, home country of the Mafia.
Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano bring Sicilian assets, contacts in New York, to naval intelligence and help design the maps, determine what the tides were, what good invasion locations were, beach terrain, and where Nazi strongholds were.
As American troops poured ashore in Sicily, the mob assistance proved invaluable. But the Navy knew it was playing a dangerous game.
The only thing worse than Operation Underworld, as it was called, failing, what if it succeeds? You're now in business with the mob.
Sicily was conquered in just 6 weeks. But this was not a story that the US government wanted made public. The mob's wartime collaboration was hushed up. Charlie Luciano was released from prison, but immediately deported to Italy. As for Lansky, he found that in the eyes of the government, he remained a hoodlum. His patriotism had failed to win him respectability. And if he really wanted to leave the streets behind, there was another millstone hanging around his neck. Bugsy Siegel.
Siegel stayed on killing people even after Meyer kind of slid out of this, what they used to call the Bugs and Meyer mob. Bugsy Siegel was a wacko. He was a crazy guy, and he did a lot of the... I never saw any indication that Lansky himself ever killed anybody. Siegel, on the other hand, he enjoyed it, and he killed a lot of people. Now, how many, I don't know. Could have been 5, could have been 20.
Siegel had by now moved to California, where his film star looks helped gain him entree to the Hollywood set. But Siegel's dreams were focused elsewhere. A few hours' drive inland, a dusty desert stopover called Las Vegas.
There were these rundown gambling operations in this desert city, Las Vegas, that already existed there. What Siegel realized was these dusty, smoky, rundown places had potential to be something bigger.
The great advantage of Las Vegas was that it was in Nevada, the one state in the Union where gambling was legal. Siegel set about building his own luxury hotel casino, the Flamingo, the first in Las Vegas, with money borrowed from Lansky and other East Coast mobsters. The project quickly ran into trouble.
He never respected budgets. He thought that everything was limitless. And what starts as $1 million ends up becoming, you know what, it's not $1 million, I need 3. You know what, it's not 3, I need 6.
The situation was complicated by the influence of Siegel's girlfriend, glamorous former dancer and mob courier, Virginia Hill.
No.
Her abrasive personality would later be displayed before a Senate commission on organized crime.
I never got money from any of those fellas. None of those fellas. None of these that I've been reading about, and none that I knew. They never gave me anything.
Siegel's mob backers suspected Virginia Hill was stealing their money. But Bugsy Siegel was not the sort of man to listen to criticism of either himself or his girlfriend.
He was a very arrogant guy who would just basically tell him to go screw, you know, and he wasn't going to deal with these. He left it to Lansky to deal with these guys back in the East Coast.
Meyer pleaded with Ben Siegel to get things under control at the Flamingo, to start being more respectful of investors, to stop running around Hollywood going to parties. But you don't tell a 41-year-old man that you're not going to go trick-or-treating if you misbehave.
Eventually, the patience of Siegel's mob backers ran out. Just a few hours after Siegel's death, the Flamingo Hotel received a couple of visitors.
2 men, Mo Sedway and Gus Greenbaum, walked to the Flamingo and said, we're in charge now. And somebody said, well, this is Ben Siegel's place. And they said, Ben is dead.
Mo Sedway and Gus Greenbaum were both business partners of Meyer Lansky's. It is inconceivable Lansky had been unaware of the fate that awaited his oldest friend. 40 years later, after Lansky's death, Lansky's second wife, Teddy, was asked about the murder.
I think he felt badly for the family, and they were buddies from the time they were youngsters.
There were reports that he was involved in the death.
I don't believe that. Circumstances sometimes make you think, but he would never directly have anything to do with anything like that.
Directly.
That's right.
Lansky may not have ordered Siegel's death, but he benefited. For all that he craved respectability, this was the life he'd chosen.
I suppose we could say there's a hypocrisy here. In all my research into Lansky, I never discovered him being personally responsible, personally fingering, personally instructing the death of anyone. But he made his money and he worked in an environment where murder was the ultimate sanction, and where those who failed to stick by the code paid in that way.
The image of Lansky as a dangerous mobster was about to become forever established in the public consciousness. In 1950, the US Congress set up the Kefauver Commission, its first ever probe into organized crime.
You must have in your mind some things you've done that you can speak of to your credit as an American citizen. If so, what are they?
Paid my tax.
The commission focused primarily on the easy target of gambling, with the result that Lansky emerged as a far more important figure in organized crime than he was. Lansky was furious.
In one of the breaks in the hearings, Meyer said to Kefauver, "Senator, I don't know what you have against gambling. You gamble." And Kefauver snapped, "That's true. I do like gambling. I just don't want you people controlling it. You people." And one of the things that Meyer wrote in private notes is that gambling will become the biggest business in America once they run the Jewish and Italian boys. You people, out of it.
In fact, Senator Kefauver gambled on horses, which was perfectly legal. But for Lansky, it was another example of the hypocrisy of the establishment. The elite always looked upon gambling as an evil, Lansky wrote. Only when they used it as a pleasure or for the purpose of personal gain was it legitimate and not sinful. Once more, he felt he was a victim of anti-Semitism.
You just had to say Jewish financier in the background, working with Italian mobsters. It played to so many stereotypes. It was so damning to Meyer Lansky's reputation. He never recovered from it.
In the aftermath of the Kefauver Commission, there was a crackdown on illegal casinos of the type Lansky ran in New York, Florida, and other states.
Let this be a warning to all racketeers and gangsters that they of their ilk will not be tolerated in San Francisco.
For Lansky, his dream of respectability seemed further off than ever. But as one door closed, another opened. Cuba in the 1950s was Las Vegas by the sea.
Cuba was better. Havana was better than Las Vegas. First of all, it was closer to New York. It was close to Florida. They could bring these people on airplanes, you know, quickly, and lots of them. Bring the entertainers in. Have an open city with every kind of vice you could imagine, with girls and cockfights and whatever guys like. Havana was the best of the best.
Lansky was invited to Cuba in 1953 by Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista to help run the country's casinos.
When Lansky and some of his friends arrived, they were welcomed because they would run straight games. And then from Lansky's point of view, how marvelous to come to a country where they are not hypocritically denounced, but their skills are recognized.
Lansky helped turn Havana into America's playground, where the elite could enjoy all the vices denied them in the newly moralistic atmosphere back home. Among those who visited was future President John F. Kennedy.
Did Meyer know John Kennedy from Havana days, from trips there?
Yes.
What was he looking for in Havana? Gambling, women?
You said it, the second one.
Oh, a lot of people look for that in Havana.
Oh, yes. He told them where to go for it.
Lansky now embarked on his most ambitious project yet, the construction of the Riviera Hotel Casino on the Havana seafront.
We know from the evidence of the Riviera Hotel that by the mid-50s, he was worth $17, $18 million, which was a lot of money in those days. And he plowed it all into bricks and mortar and air conditioning and gold tiles and so on. It's a wonderful hotel by the standards of the 1950s. It's the first to have air conditioning. You go inside the casino, it's a wonderful mosaic tiled, egg-shaped room. Still, with all the glamour of a Humphrey Bogart, Lauren Bacall film. And that's where he put his money.
It was the largest single investment Lansky ever made.
I think Meyer was focusing on Havana to clean up his fortune. That was going to be his Kennedy moment. Havana was legal.
But Lansky had bet wrong. By the time the Riviera opened in 1958, Fidel Castro's leftist rebels were closing in on the capital. In the early hours of New Year's Day, 1959, the dictator fled the country.
At first, the celebration was peaceful as shouting, cheering crowds surged through the city. Then the temper of the throng changed, and an ugly mob ranged the streets. Its prime targets, the symbols of the overthrown regime: the gambling casinos, the parking meters, the homes and businesses of Batista's cronies.
The casinos were looted and then seized by the new government.
6 years of surface.
When Castro came out of the hills, Lansky lost his money, Pepsi Cola lost their money, United Tobacco lost their money, General Motors lost their money. All the big American corporations lost the money that they had. So the world's cleverest gambler, at the end of the day, made a bad gamble.
Lansky now moved permanently to Miami. He was almost 60 and in poor health, but his return to America coincided with a renewed offensive against organized crime.
Attorney General Robert Kennedy paints a grim picture of the rise of lawlessness under the Cosa Nostra, or Mafia. This he describes as the government of organized gambling, narcotics peddling, extortion, racketeering, and controlling of certain trade unions.
With Bobby Kennedy at the Justice Department, the government had the Mafia in its sights. Lansky was still regarded as the mastermind of the mob and found himself under almost constant surveillance.
Meyer is being dogged 24 hours a day, 7 days a week by the authorities, by local authorities, by the FBI.
I knew them by heart. They were my buddies. If I saw them at the racetrack, I used to tell them, I'm going to report you to the FBI. You're not supposed to be gambling.
His wife, Teddy, one time was asked, did your husband have bodyguards? She said, yeah, the FBI. They were always there.
Listening bugs were placed in his house and at hotels he stayed in, but they yielded little. Spends much time lounging around his home, read this report from July the 7th, 1962. Main pursuits seem to be playing gin rummy with friends, watching TV, and reading.
All those wiretaps, bugs that the FBI did in the 1960s, every single bug was successful in getting good stuff, good intelligence for the FBI, except Lansky's. Lansky's was a total zero.
But the bugging did yield one conversation, which has gone down in mob folklore. It happened on the evening of May 27th, 1962. While subject and wife were watching television, the FBI report read, TV panelists referred to organized crime as being second only in size to the government itself. Lansky remarked to his wife that organized crime was bigger than US Steel. Lansky's exact words were not written down, and the tape was then reused, but the report was later leaked to the press. By the time the movie Godfather 2 was made in 1974, the scriptwriters had Hyman Roth, a character based on Lansky, narrowing his eyes and murmuring, "Michael, we're bigger than US Steel."
In fact, the record shows he did not say we're bigger than US Steel. And of course, since it's not recorded, we don't know in what tone he said it. Could he have been sardonic? Could he have been sarcastic and saying, it's bigger than US Steel? We don't know. But he himself would always say, when am I supposed to have said that? But of course, it stuck to him like a sort of catchphrase for the rest of his life, and of course, was finally immortalized on the silver screen.
In March 1970, police finally managed to arrest Lansky at Miami Airport on drugs charges.
The drug bust in 1970 I thought was a travesty and a joke, because basic charge was that he left the country to go to Mexico for a vacation, I believe, and had these drugs on him without having a prescription for it.
The so-called drugs were in fact medicines for a stomach complaint.
I thought it was pure poppycock.
The case was thrown out, but Lansky had had enough. For 40 years he had sought respectability and acceptance as an American citizen. Now he turned his back on his adopted country. In July 1970, he moved to Israel and applied for citizenship.
All through his life, he has had this pride in his Jewish identity. He takes pride in the creation of the State of Israel, which puts into practice the toughness and the courage that he saw back in his youth in Grodno. And here's a whole country that embodies it.
Lansky is living in an exclusive resort hotel, the Acadia, north of Tel Aviv. He's not exactly in the market for publicity.
Lansky found himself pursued by the American media. But while in Israel, he granted Israeli TV a rare interview, presenting himself as a victim of persecution.
Mr. Lansky, if the accusations against you are false, why don't you go back to the United States and demand justice?
I think it would be terribly hard for one to get a fair trial, as much as I believe in the American courts.
Are you a religious Jew?
No, I'm not a religious Jew.
And what are...
But I'm a Jew, in my heart.
I think that there was probably a sense that we're all mishpucha, we're all family. And of course they're going to let me in. There's a law, the law of return. What they didn't bank on was that it would be a political hot potato.
The Americans were still pursuing Lansky and were pressuring for his return. The case was referred to Israel's Prime Minister, Golda Meir.
She didn't know Meyer Lansky from hole in the wall. And somebody said he wants to be a citizen of Israel, and she said, fine, I don't see any problem with that. And then another one of her advisors said, you know, we understand he's in the Mafia. Golda Meir said, Mafia? Mafia? No Mafia.
Lansky's application for citizenship was denied, and he was expelled from Israel. Lansky's wife, Teddy, arrived back in America literally spitting with fury.
Now look, go away from me, I'll kill you!
Lansky himself was immediately arrested. The government had finally succeeded in putting together a case against him, a case that rested on the evidence of a low-level mobster turned police informant called Fat Vinny.
Fat Vinny was Vincent Teresa, who was a hoodlum from Massachusetts. He was, a thief and an extortionist, and he had been a federal witness in 38 Mafia trials that the Department of Justice had brought.
Fat Vinny claimed that in 1968 he'd made 2 deliveries of cash to Meyer Lansky of income from the Colony Club Casino in London. It was the big break the government had been looking for.
Here's a guy who actually was willing to testify, who put money in Lansky's hands, $150,000. That's substantial compared to what his tax return said.
Like Al Capone 40 years before, Lansky was facing charges of tax evasion. Arriving at court, he was relaxed.
Are you pleased with the way your attorneys handled your defense?
I'm sorry, but no comment.
Well, you can't blame me for asking, can you?
No, I don't blame you at all.
Inside, the assistant prosecutor found a man very different from the one he had been expecting.
He was a gentleman, not a wise guy. It was clear that he'd read a lot. He was very articulate, very charming. If you didn't know any better, you'd think he was an executive of an American corporation.
The prosecution was led by a young Justice Department attorney called R.J. Campbell.
We felt that if he had to defend himself, we could really get after him, because I had a mountain of material to cross-examine him on. So I was ready, prepared long and hard for Lansky to take the stand. He did not take the stand. What he did was put his wife on the stand.
Teddy Lansky produced receipts from a hotel to show her husband had been in Boston at precisely the time Fat Vinny claimed to have been handing money to him in Miami.
So, we were hanging by our threads, right? Because once the witness has lied about one thing in his testimony, you are a gone goose.
It was a very thin case. We'd have been better off leaving Lansky in Israel.
Lansky was acquitted. The little man walked free. For some, it was further evidence of his fiendish brilliance. But for others, doubts were beginning to creep in that Lansky really was as rich and powerful as the government and the press claimed.
Let's put it this way, he lived very modestly. We never caught him spending much money on anything. He had nice suits. It doesn't cost that much to buy a suit. He just lived modestly.
Have a good weekend.
So, mastermind of the mob, or as Lansky himself claimed, a retired investor living on a modest pension. Only in 1983 would the truth be revealed. Lansky died in his bed of cancer. His family gathered for the reading of the will. They too were hoping it would reveal hidden riches. They were disappointed.
I do believe there was a moment of recognition that, boy, this reality is very different than we thought it would be. Because to my knowledge, nobody in that family has a lot of money, and it's not because they secretly do and have hidden it so cleverly. I don't buy it.
I spent a lot of time with his crippled son, Buddy, who, after his death, was living on state charity, something Meyer had always tried to avoid in his lifetime, but he couldn't leave enough money for his beloved crippled son to survive. I think it defies the rules of human behavior that they would go through such denial of comfort for the sake of proving what?
Meyer Lansky never was the all-powerful godfather some believed. And he lost the bulk of the fortune he had in Havana in 1959. Under constant surveillance by the government, from 1960, he was effectively retired. And he spent most of what he had left on his various legal battles.
How would you describe yourself? As a human being.
He saw himself as a victim of hypocrisy, even anti-Semitism. But Meyer Lansky never was quite the mastermind the American public believed. He shone only in comparison with other mobsters.
Most of these organized crime guys, they're not educated at all. So we're not operating from a very high plane. So a guy comes along like Lansky, who is quick and good with numbers, and he stands out. He's only bright in connection with the other people around him. He certainly wasn't in Bill Gates and Warren Buffett's league.
You know, the cold hard evidence of Meyer Lansky, the businessman, suggests that he wasn't quite the business brains that everybody thought he was, or that he thought he was himself.
But the American public is reluctant to abandon the myth.
The great irony is the proof you are a mastermind is that nobody can find any proof. Everybody was running around looking for banks and pawns in this vast game, and they couldn't find them. And then when they couldn't find them, they said, man, this guy's good. There is this belief, especially in America, in the mystical power of the mob. And so when Meyer Lansky would walk his dog, people would go, ah, he's just walking his dog. He's doing the whole walking his dog low-key ruse. No, he was walking his dog.
In 1979, the FBI launched a vast electronic surveillance operation at one criminal in particular, Alan Dorfman.
Alan Dorfman was the man that got things done, the power broker.
Alan Dorfman wasn't a mafioso. He wasn't even Italian. He was Jewish, and his weapon was not a gun, but a pen.
Dorfman was a white-collar type thug.
He had no real scruples or morals.
Dorfman's crime was to raid $1 billion pension fund for his Mafia bosses.
The pension fund was a gold mine.
As the Mafia's banker, he financed their huge casinos in Las Vegas.
He was a very powerful associate because he made money for them.
Dorfman was close to the Mafia's heart and in the crosshairs of the FBI. This is the extraordinary story of how the FBI hunted Alan Dorfman, bugged his business, and caused one of the biggest disasters in Mafia history. Alan Dorfman need not have been a mobster. After the Second World War, he returned to America a decorated Marine. But he could only find work as a women's self-defense instructor and sports coach, earning just $4,000 a year. Dorfman was going nowhere, and he wanted more. Luckily, he was close to one influential person who could fix him up: his stepfather. Paul Red Dorfman was a tough, old-school Chicago mobster. His power base was in the growing trade union movement, including the mighty Teamsters Union. By 1953, with 1.2 million members working in transport nationwide, a Teamsters strike could paralyze the United States. The Teamsters had what the mob liked: real muscle. An ambitious Teamsters official, Jimmy Hoffa, wanted to become president at the top of the powerful union. Red Dorfman agreed to help.
There was a lot of intelligence information that Hoffa had made accommodations with organized crime in order to rise to the power that he developed.
In return for supporting Hoffa, Red Dorfman wanted something back: a job for his son, running the Teamsters' lucrative insurance business. No matter that Alan Dorfman had no financial qualifications or insurance experience, he didn't even have an office. Such was the power of the mob that Dorfman's hastily set up insurance agency got the contract. The Teamsters employers now paid Dorfman's agency an insurance premium for every union man. And so, for new insurance executive Alan Dorfman, the good times began to roll.
He had very expensive clothes. I remember he wore what was clearly a very expensive camel hair coat. He drove expensive cars. He had a very nice house in Lincolnwood. He went out to eat at fancy restaurants. He had plenty of cash to spend.
The deal worked out well for both sides. Over the next 10 years, Alan Dorfman became a millionaire. And mob-backed Jimmy Hoffa rose fast in the Teamsters Union. But there was a cloud on the horizon. In Washington, the authorities were increasingly concerned by the unholy alliance of organized crime and the labor movement. In 1957, the United States Senate McClellan Committee began investigating union officials and mob associates. That meant trouble for Jimmy Hoffa and Alan Dorfman. Government agents discovered that Alan Dorfman had made $3 million from Teamsters insurance policies. Half of it by wildly overcharging on the premiums. The high insurance fees were not illegal, and the committee could do nothing about it. But committee investigators did soon discover illegal practices. Dorfman had siphoned off over $330,000 in cash from his company for unspecified expenses, and Hoffa had been lent cash that was never returned. A young lawyer, Robert F. Kennedy, was the committee's legal counsel. He asked Hoffa to explain himself.
Did you borrow all this money on the same day, and you don't know what it was for?
Was for expenditures that I needed at that time. I can't recall offhand.
And this was in cash also?
That's right.
And no collateral, no note?
That's right.
And no interest paid?
That's right.
Has it been paid back?
No, it has not.
Although the committee strongly suspected that stolen cash was being used for illegal payoffs and kickbacks to union officials, they couldn't prove it. That left Hoffa and Dorfman at liberty to exploit the wealthy Teamsters union on an unprecedented scale. Although the Teamsters insurance business was a good money spinner for Dorfman, it was dwarfed by the possibilities of the vast Teamsters pension fund. Millions of dollars in workers' contributions poured in every month. The question was, where to invest it? Other funds invested prudently, spreading risk, but Alan Dorfman helped Hoffa pour tens of millions of dollars of Teamsters loans into just one client's pocket, the mob.
Teamsters especially, the pension fund, was a gold mine. It was the goose that laid the golden egg.
The Central States Pension Fund earned the nickname the Mafia Bank. And what did the gangsters do with all these millions? They built casino hotels in the Nevada desert. Las Vegas.
The first casino out here, the Flamingo Hotel, was built by the mob. As a strip group, not all of it was mob money. Most of it was.
The Stardust, the Fremont, and the Desert Inn were all funded by multi-million-dollar loans from the Teamsters Pension Fund. And in the 1960s, these casinos were owned and controlled by the Mafia.
Dorfman was absolutely instrumental in that. He engineered, by and large, the mob's influence in the Las Vegas casinos and the purchase of those casinos with the hidden interests of the various mobsters.
Hoffa and Dorfman approved 60 loans totaling a mammoth $91 million on strangely favorable terms to the mob.
The people who got the loans did not have to pledge any collateral, did not have to have the normal background checks that a bank would have conducted before giving multi-million-dollar loans.
There was a reason for this lax lending policy. Every time they approved a loan, up to 10% was taken as a kickback by Hoffa and Dorfman.
Alan Dorfman arranged a lot of loans. He took a fee on every one of them.
The kickbacks could be huge.
If you want to put up a building, and it would cost, with your profit, $900,000 to put it up, but you've got to give me $100,000, you make your bid $1 million.
Everybody thought that was fine. There was enough money for everybody.
The Mafia generally didn't like to pay money back. But provided Hoffa and Dorfman got their kickback, they didn't seem to care if the Teamsters never saw their money again. Dorfman and Hoffa were riding high, but 1961 saw in a new government and the return of an old enemy. Robert Kennedy was appointed U.S. Attorney General. As the top law enforcement officer in America, Kennedy's stated goal was to break the grip of organized crime. He set about radically changing the Department of Justice and the FBI. Kennedy launched a new kind of investigative unit, a Department of Justice strike force aimed at union corruption. And Kennedy dramatically increased the number of lawyers in the organized crime and racketeering section from 17 to 63. One unit was very much at the forefront of the campaign.
It was called the Labor Rights Unit, and I was in it. And the press called it the Get Hoffa Unit.
To get Hoffa was harder than it sounds. In October 1962, the unit did prosecute Hoffa, alleging he'd received improper payments from a trucking company. But the verdict was far from certain. Then, they got lucky. During the trial, Hoffa played straight into the government's hands.
If he'd accepted the jury verdict, he would have been found not guilty, and it would have been potentially a major victory for him.
A powerful manipulator and used to getting his own way, Hoffa just couldn't leave the verdict to chance.
He had to fix the jury, and he got caught fixing the jury, and that's obstruction of justice, and then he was convicted.
A maximum one-year sentence suddenly grew a whole lot bigger. Hoffa's mob-style jewelry tampering had backfired badly.
Outside the district court building in the nation's capital, Teamster boss James Hoffa surrenders to U.S. Marshals to begin serving an 8-year prison term for jury tampering.
Hoffa was gone. But for at least one person, this was a great opportunity. Before he went to jail, Hoffa announced, "Alan speaks for me on all pension fund questions." In those few words, the one-time sports coach was made one of the United States' most powerful financiers. Alan Dorfman now controlled a vast $400 million mountain of money.
The title CEO of Crime Inc. would be a good description of Dorfman, or perhaps a better one would be Chief Financial Officer of the mob. I don't think anybody could have done what he did because he had the skills and the character and the lack of morality to do what was necessary for the mob.
But Dorfman discovered he was not allowed complete control. Access to the pension fund was just too important to the mob. The Chicago outfit decided to safeguard the Mafia bank. They gave Dorfman an advisor, Joey the Clown Lombardo.
The outfit did not trust Alan Dorfman and therefore placed Lombardo in the position that he had, which was an overseer.
Joey the Clown Lombardo was a serious mobster. He may have earned his name joking around, but he was a shrewd businessman and a killer.
I don't think Lombardo respected anyone. I think he had a grudging respect for Dorfman for what he could do. But Joe Lombardo liked Joe Lombardo, and that was about the extent of the people he liked.
It was Lombardo who oversaw the Las Vegas casinos. And now, although he had no official position, guided Alan Dorfman at the Teamsters Pension Fund.
He did show up on almost a daily basis to find out exactly what Dorfman was doing and to provide guidance, to direct Dorfman to make sure that he did as the outfit wanted him to do.
That's the one person you don't hear Dorfman arguing much with.
But the two men got along well. With Lombardo's backing, Dorfman approved million-dollar loans designed to leach cash directly into mob hands.
It was no secret that he was in the pocket of organized crime. He was a tool of the Chicago outfit. They controlled Dorfman.
No matter that a string of businesses invested in by the Teamsters Pension Fund went bust, and millions of dollars was effectively stolen in the process.
Dorfman was a white-collar type thug. He controlled money. Dorfman would never be involved in a burglary or an armed robbery or an extortion. That's not what he did. He was a different kind of criminal.
Defaulted loans to just one businessman cost the pension fund $15 million. But Dorfman couldn't care less. He got paid thousands of dollars in a kickback on every one. Business was so good that he now crisscrossed the states in a private jet he'd bought from Frank Sinatra. But when one such deal and kickback went sour, the FBI pounced. In October 1972, the court in Chicago heard how businessman Leo Horvath had applied for a Teamsters loan of $1.5 million. He had personally paid Dorfman a $55,000 kickback in cash. 2 days later, Dorfman approved the loan. At last, this scam was exposed, and Dorfman was found guilty. It seemed the Mafia's banker was in real trouble. But for some reason, the trial judge sentenced Dorfman to just 1 year in federal prison. Far from being a killer blow to his career, it hardly even broke his stride.
In the 1972 fraud conviction, didn't rat on anyone, which probably enhanced his reputation with the mob at that time. And he did his thing and came out and kept on going.
With Lombardo behind him, Dorfman's looting of the Teamsters Pension Fund didn't merely continue uninterrupted, but shifted into high gear as never before. Between 1972 and 1976, he approved $186 million in loans to finance fevered mob development of Las Vegas casinos. $20 million went to Caesar's Palace alone, and $23 million to Circus Circus. And the kickback to Dorfman, 7% of Circus Circus Corporation shares, potentially worth millions. But the FBI hadn't given up the hunt for Dorfman. In 1974, they'd found enough evidence to charge Dorfman and Lombardo with milking the Teamsters Pension Fund of $1.4 million. Dorfman was again just a step away from a long prison sentence. Key witness for the prosecution was businessman Daniel Seifert, who had been talking to the feds. If Seifert testified, Lombardo and Dorfman were both going down. The Mafia didn't hesitate to protect their biggest source of ready cash.
They had no hesitation eliminating witnesses if it would keep them out of court.
One Saturday, Seifert went to his office to meet his wife. Mrs. Seifert was pushed at gunpoint into a washroom. Seifert made a run for it. The first shotgun blast failed to stop him, but a second blast to the chest brought him down. Finally, to leave no doubt, Daniel Seifert was shot at point-blank range. As Seifert fell, so did the court case. Lombardo and Dorfman walked free again. It was clear to the Department of Justice and the FBI that Joe Lombardo and the Chicago outfit would stop at nothing to keep Dorfman and the Mafia bank in business. And they were right. Even old friends were not safe. On the 23rd of December, 1971, Jimmy Hoffa had been given an early Christmas present. A pardon from President Nixon. But although released from prison, Hoffa also wanted something else, his old job back.
I have never sold a work around. I have negotiated the best contracts in America. Nobody can deny it. They don't even try to deny it. I've got eyeglasses, teeth, pension funds, conditions, and the highest wages in the whole world for our people. Talk to our people. Let them be the judge whether or not I'm a labor leader or whether I'm a crook.
The Mafia bosses felt their money machine was working well and considered Dorfman to be an essential cog. The return of Hoffa was something they could do without. Hoffa now rounded angrily on the mob. He spoke openly in the papers and on radio and television about exposing mob corruption and getting the mob out of the Teamsters Union. He even threatened to stop the Mafia from using the pension fund.
Jimmy Hoffa sincerely thought of himself as a tough guy, as tough as anybody in the mob. He never thought that he would come to the end he came to at the hands of the mob.
On the 30th of July, 1975, Jimmy Hoffa went missing.
Hoffa was last seen alive at the fashionable Red Fox restaurant in a Detroit suburb. He waited there in vain to keep an appointment. Hoffa left his car in the restaurant car park when he vanished, and in spite of an intensive search around Detroit, there's been sight nor sound of him since.
The FBI put 200 agents on the Hoffa disappearance and spent millions to find him. To this day, his body has never been found. If the mob thought Hoffa's disappearance had blown the FBI off course, they were wrong. In 1978, the government began to form an attack plan to get rid of Alan Dorfman once and for all.
We were after Dorfman, make no mistake about it, because he was the gear that made everything run as far as controlling of the Central States Pension Fund.
Stopping Dorfman would not only cut off the Mafia's money supply. More than that, following the trail of dodgy loans would allow them to convict mobsters throughout the U.S.
If we penetrated Dorfman and his contacts, we could get to other aspects of his association, which would include the mob, which would include the Teamsters, and as it turned out, high-ranking government officials.
The FBI realized that snaring Dorfman was not going to be quick or easy. To have any chance of success, they would have to use surreptitious electronic surveillance far more extensively than ever before. The plan was to record all Dorfman's phone conversations with his associates in the hope that they would incriminate themselves.
That was a tremendous manpower drain, and it was really a fight to get the FBI at that time to agree to put that many people in the case.
FBI chiefs worried that penetrating Dorfman was looking just too expensive.
They were concerned as to how long it would continue, which was fairly perceptive on their part because we intended to continue it as long as we could.
Another obstacle was that just tapping Dorfman's phone calls was far from straightforward.
Each call that came in on a separate line could have been transferred to Alan Dorfman in his office. And therefore, we could not simply tap one line. We had to tap all lines going into that office.
The problem was that for wiretap evidence to be admissible at trial, they would need a court warrant for each individual line.
We were going to be forced to request the ability to tap into approximately 15 or 16 telephone lines.
But in the end, they decided they had to go for Dorfman. On the 29th of January 1979, a court gave permission for multiple wiretaps, and Operation Pendorf began. The FBI rented offices nearby so the telephone company could redirect the phone lines. Agents could monitor and record all of Dorfman's phone conversations. Immediately, his world opened up to them. On that very first day, they heard Dorfman brokering a $90 million deal for the mob concerning the Aladdin Casino Hotel, Las Vegas.
Dorfman's days, as best as we could tell, when he was in the office, when he was actually working and not playing golf, was mainly communicating with the gangsters, fulfilling their needs, a problem solver, influence peddling, everything you'd think a power broker in legitimate business would do today.
Just how far removed Dorfman was from legitimate business was shown only a few days later. On February the 2nd, agents were stunned when Dorfman's conversations involved loan sharking, a takeover of the Teamsters pension fund, the unlawful use of gold certificates, and even a plan to kill the Teamsters president. And that was just one day's work for Alan Dorfman. Over the next 6 months, the FBI monitored 112,000 phone calls, recorded over 3,500, and focused on nearly 1,000 conversations. But it wasn't enough. The FBI needed to hear all of Dorfman's business conversations, not just when he was on the phone. To do that, they would have to bug his office.
The information that we developed on the telephones led us to have sufficient probable cause to ask the courts for the ability to put a microphone in his office.
But installing a secret microphone infringes a citizen's right to privacy. Getting court approval for this would be even more difficult.
Everyone was a little bit more skittish about that because the expectation of privacy was of considerable concern. So it was often much more difficult to get a bug because you had to show more satisfy the officials in Washington that this was something that should be done.
Doug Roller won the argument in Washington and persuaded a federal judge to grant the warrant. With this to back them up, all the FBI now had to do was break into Dorfman's office.
We entered Dorfman's office surreptitiously late at night because we had an informant who worked for Alan Dorfman's office. We simply had my informant rent a parking place under the building, and we drove into the underground parking, and went up into the building and went into the office.
Agents made 7 night raids to plant 2 microphones. Now, rather than his businesslike telephone manner, they got the real Alan Dorfman.
But all you get from him is promise. All I know is we ain't got a thing. Now where the f*** we going?
He was very gruff, a lot of profanities, and very arrogant, and became angered when what he wanted was not being done.
Did you ever give me a dime, Morris? You ever give him a dime? If you did, I don't know about it. And if you did, I don't give a because I didn't get nothing.
He did not mince words, and most of his conversations were laced with profanity.
But when the FBI microphones overheard Dorfman's meetings with Joey the Clown Lombardo, the agents heard the usually arrogant loudmouth transform.
He would walk around Las Vegas shouting orders like a Marine sergeant. And then when he met the mob boss in Chicago, he was a meek, mild businessman.
What did he get out of it? I would say he got somewhere between 3 and 5 million. Yeah, got 3 and 5. 25% beyond. Right. That's the player we want right away. Well, you can make the demands. Make the demands. Now he's in trouble.
Our opinion of Joe Lombardo actually improved as we listened to the conversations. We overheard conversations most mornings where they were reading the Wall Street Journal, they were discussing the articles, and really there was no difference in the understanding of the material on the part of Lombardo as compared to Dorfman.
But there was a significant difference between Joey Lombardo and Alan Dorfman, as Lombardo clearly revealed on tape in a meeting with Morris Schenker, a Dorfman associate.
Alan's meek and Alan is harmless, but the people behind him are not meek and harmless. You know what I mean? But I'll tell you one thing. You said you're 72? I'm just telling you. I'm just telling you. If they come back and tell me to give you a message, and if you want to fire him, I assure you that you will never reach 73.
What the FBI had long suspected was now admitted on tape. Joey Lombardo was a mob enforcer and would stop at nothing to back up their money man, Alan Dorfman. Over 2,000 reels of Dorfman at his office, on the phone and in meetings, were recorded and transcribed. Even though he was unaware of this, Dorfman seemed careful and guarded.
Alan Dorfman, like a lot of the gangsters, didn't think that they would be caught. They thought they were too smart.
But Alan Dorfman made a mistake. With the mics on and the reels rolling, Dorfman was chatting with associates when he referred to an incriminating meeting. Thanks to the wiretaps, a jaw-dropping and damning story unfurled. Teamsters president, Roy L. Williams, had a problem with the government bill to deregulate the trucking industry. Any breakup of the Teamsters monopoly meant a loss of money and power for the union. Another person with a problem was Howard W. Cannon, the powerful senator for Nevada. Land developers were eyeing a plot next to his exclusive Las Vegas country club home. The planned 9-story apartment blocks would spoil his view and damage property values. The vacant lot was owned by the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund. At a meeting on Wednesday, January the 10th, 1979, Cannon and Williams met with power broker Alan Dorfman. Senator Cannon asked Dorfman whether he might arrange to sell him the 6 acres abutting his fancy home. Williams asked Senator Cannon whether he might arrange to personally oversee the trucking deregulation bill. They agreed a deal, in effect, a bribe. And to bribe a US senator is a crime. In Washington, Cannon delivered on his part of the bargain. As chairman, he steered the trucking bill into his Commerce Committee, where it was delayed and watered down. But Dorfman found to his dismay that he couldn't deliver on his side. Recent legislation had stopped him dealing in land as he pleased. The Bugs heard Dorfman vent his frustration.
In the Bug, Dorfman is going on about, you know how terrible this was. These guys are pieces of shit. And in the old days, we could have just had the Teamsters out there bought in and give it to them. But we can't do that now because everyone's watching us.
A hidden microphone in Dorfman's office on May the 21st, 1979, captured the moment when Senator Cannon called to ask how the land deal was coming along. Embarrassed, Dorfman could only apologize for the delay. After he hung up, Dorfman announced to an associate,
"That was Senator Cannon."
How's he doing?
Huh? He's around like no man has ever been around.
He took care of deregulation, didn't he? Did he take care of deregulation?
Of course, but we ain't fulfilled our commitment to him yet. You know, I'm surprised he still even talks to me.
Senator Cannon never did get the real estate he wanted. But the FBI did get what they wanted. An incriminating tape recording. A clear record that Dorfman was involved in bribing a US senator. At the beginning of 1980, after a record-breaking 13 months, the Chicago strike force went public with Operation Pendorf. The top-secret surveillance had worked. Senator Cannon was quick to defend himself from press accusations of any wrongdoing.
I unequivocally deny the implications of news reports that there is any connection between my handling of trucking legislation in the Senate and the resolution of a land use dispute in Nevada involving a homeowners group of which I was one member.
If Cannon was allowed to get away with it, Dorfman was not. The man who had stolen the Teamsters' millions was still in the sights of Chicago strike force leader Doug Roller.
We felt by the time the wiretap was over that we had a great deal of evidence to put together a prosecution. I felt we had an ironclad case.
But though it seemed that at last the FBI had Alan Dorfman on the ropes, he appeared unconcerned.
Dorfman in court was, most of the time, an arrogant gentleman. Although he was physically in court, present, that he was aloof to what was going on.
Yet despite the cool veneer, Dorfman was feeling the pressure.
At one occasion during the course of the trial, Alan introduced his son to me and stating that this is the who wants to put me in jail. I just told Alan, you're a real class act, and walked away.
Dorfman faced the possibility of a long sentence, but he may have had reason to believe help was at hand. Because Dorfman could rely on more than just his lawyers. To protect their banker, the Mafia were helping the jurors come to a sensible decision.
Several jurors received early morning telephone calls from someone with a deep, gravelly voice who made insinuations about not knowing the whole story of the case.
When the jurors reported the illegal phone calls to the judge, he immediately sequestered them. They were held in a hotel, under guard, cut off from any outside interference. For once, the underworld's attempts at jury tampering failed. Traditional mob methods just didn't work anymore. No shotgun blasts could silence a witness. As the Pendorf tapes were played in court, the battle lines with the Mafia were redrawn. The accused had now become witnesses against themselves. As Dorfman's tape played, profanity, anger, and frustration resounded in court.
You know, when this commitment was arranged, Roy, you sat in the same room. You made the same commitment I made. Now, the property's gone. Let it go. But I'll tell you something. I don't give a if you have a deregulation shoved up your or whatever happens.
Best evidence you can use in court is the defendant's own words. You cannot undo your words. You might try to explain them away, but if there are enough words there, you're sunk.
On December the 15th, 1982, Alan Dorfman, charged with conspiring to bribe Senator Howard Cannon, received the jury's verdict. Guilty. Operation Pendorf had struck its target, and it was a devastating blow. It was a grim Christmas in Chicago for 60-year-old Alan Dorfman. Although he was released on bail, the new year might bring him a 55-year prison sentence. But sentencing was not for 8 weeks. Plenty of time to cut a deal.
Facing a prison term would not have been something that Dorfman would have looked forward to. With his high lifestyle, all the accoutrements of the rich that he had would all be taken away in prison.
There was now concern at the highest levels of the mob that Dorfman might not be tough enough to accept his fate and would negotiate with the Justice Department to reduce his sentence.
There had to be fear that in order to keep his sentence down or to keep from even being put in prison, Alan Dorfman might want to cooperate with the federal government.
Aging, out of power, and facing prison. If ever there was a good time for Dorfman to roll over on his mob friends, this was it.
The number of secrets that Alan Dorfman could have told us, it just boggled the mind. I believe that he could have helped us to completely cripple Cleveland, Chicago, Kansas City, Las Vegas, and maybe Los Angeles. He knew everything.
He heard things he shouldn't be hearing. He's seen things he shouldn't have been seeing.
We felt he would be vulnerable to an offer to diminish his prison sentence in return for his cooperation. Never got that far because the mob was thinking the same thing.
Suddenly, the man who'd loyally bankrolled the mob for years seemed a dangerous liability. Mob bosses decided to put out a contract on Alan Dorfman. On the 20th of January, 1983, Alan Dorfman and an old friend and associate went out to eat at the Hyatt Hotel in Lincolnwood, northwest Chicago. The lunch date turned out to be a date with destiny. Alan Dorfman had just kept 30 years of mob secrets the hard way.
And it's part and parcel of life in the United States that close association with La Cosa Nostra often leads to a sudden death.
Alan Dorfman's death was a watershed for both the U.S. Mafia and U.S. law enforcement.
I believe it was one of the largest and perhaps most successful investigations of organized crime undertaken during this period.
Without Dorfman, the Mafia's money supply was suddenly cut off. This crippled the mob, and they never recovered.
No one replaced Alan Dorfman. No one replaced Alan Dorfman at all. They did not have access to that bank, and it was part of the death knell of that easy money for the mob.
Operation Pendorf had also done something else. It had proved the power of mass electronic surveillance and revolutionized the use of bugs and wiretaps.
Surreptitious electronic surveillance changed the playing field forever in favor of the government.
From now on, over and over again, electronic surveillance of a large number of mob figures and their operations would lead criminals to condemn themselves, in their own words, on tape. There was nowhere to hide, no witnesses to silence. The FBI had at last found a way to break the Mafia. Some said Tony Spilotro was a home-loving husband and dedicated father.
The image of Tony being polite, caring, family man, benevolent, that's...
Tony Spilotro was, in fact, suspected by the FBI of over 20 murders.
Tony Spilotro was a cold-blooded killer.
As Las Vegas enforcer for the Chicago Mafia, Spilotro hit whoever his bosses wanted taken care of. Anyone, anytime, any place.
I believe Tony was mental. He was animalistic.
He hung a man on a meat hook.
I think he got pleasure out of harming people.
For years, the authorities tried to lock him up, but he bought policemen, owned judges, and shot witnesses. He got away with murder for over 20 years.
To find that Tony Spilotro was going to be released back onto the street was devastating.
This is the story of the grim career of this notorious Mafia hitman, and how it was ended, not by his enemies, but by his friends. On the 15th of May, 1962, in Chicago, 2 men and a woman were found shot dead in a car. Gangsters killing gangsters was common enough in the Windy City. For the police, it was routine. But the mob was angry. This hit had not been authorized by the boss of the Chicago Mafia.
With organized crime, the violence is organized and controlled. They have very strict rules and regulations.
The dead men were well connected and should have been off limits.
A soldier has a beef or an argument with someone, he can't take it upon himself to punish that individual without getting approval from his bosses.
Someone had broken the rules, and now they must be hunted down. For this job, the Chicago Mafia bosses turned to a young hoodlum. Although he stood just 5'5", his reputation for extreme violence was huge. 25-year-old Tony Spilotro. His first task? Find out who had done it. He learned that the 2 dead gangsters had beaten up a young mob associate, Billy McCarthy, at a bar. Spilotro made inquiries of a childhood friend, minor mobster Frank Carlotta. Carlotta revealed that he'd supplied the guns for the unauthorized killing, but said he wasn't at the scene. Spilotro only agreed to spare his friend's life if he told him who had pulled the trigger. The name Carlotta gave was Billy McCarthy. After Spilotro tracked McCarthy down, he wanted to ask him a question. Did he have an accomplice? McCarthy wouldn't talk. Then Spilotro tortured him with an ice pick. Still no name. Next, Spilotro put McCarthy's head in a vice. He tightened it. The pressure forced one of McCarthy's eyeballs out of its socket. Only then did Billy McCarthy name Jimmy Miraglia. The bodies of McCarthy and Miraglia were found a week later in the trunk of an abandoned car. But the FBI could find no evidence, and no witnesses came forward in what became notorious as the M&M murders. seemed Spilotro had got away with it. Little did he think that his old friend Frank Carlotta would one day bring him down. In 1971, the Chicago bosses rewarded Spilotro for his success in this line of work. They sent their enforcer to Las Vegas. The desert town known as Sin City was in full swing.
This little town out in the desert was making tons of money for the mob.
For 25 years, America's gangsters had poured millions of dollars into building the lavish casino hotels that lined the Las Vegas Strip.
Las Vegas was a cash cow for Chicago and for some other cities, but especially for Chicago.
But the mob weren't interested in a good floor show. They were in it for one thing. The only thing. Money. The Chicago Mafia controlled some of the biggest hotel casinos in the city. But gambling profits didn't satisfy their greed. These shiny desert palaces actually had a dark purpose. They contained the mob's most profitable and top-secret racket, the skim. Cash received at a casino should be taken to a secure counting room, and the amounts entered into the accounts. But the mob-run casinos in 70s Las Vegas creamed money off the top before any bookkeeper or tax inspector even knew it existed.
It was nice. You sit in Chicago, have nothing to do with Las Vegas, and somebody brings you a bag with $50,000 in it every month or so. It was nice.
The Chicago bosses decided that Spilotro, with his tough guy reputation, was just what they needed to protect the skim. One problem was that counters were tempted to skim the skim, to palm a few dollars to line their own pockets. This temptation would be curbed by Tony Spilotro's talent for violence.
He sort of went at it as though he were running a dive in Chicago, with the blackjacks and the guns and all that sort of thing, and physical violence.
The mob also feared that staff might blab about what they saw in the counting room. But Tony Spilotro's murderous reputation guaranteed their silence.
If there was a hit that needed to be done, it was Tony's responsibility at the direction of those people back in Chicago.
The Chicago enforcer made himself at home in Las Vegas. And the neon-lit desert paradise was just perfect for a street hustler like Tony Spilotro.
Tony Spilotro, when he got to Las Vegas, found out there was no other family in here operating a street crime organization. So he had a wide open city. He could do whatever he wanted.
Spilotro soon began loan sharking to the armies of low-paid workers in the hotels and casinos, and he played by big city Chicago rules.
Chicago had a reputation, even among the loan sharks. In Chicago, miss one payment, baseball bat. Miss two payments, a bullet. They were known for that everywhere.
Spilotro also started a street robbery gang to pick pockets, mug tourists, and even burgle houses. Muggings and robberies became a fact of life in Las Vegas. But just as his new career as a Las Vegas street boss was getting going, the FBI got a chance to stop him in his tracks. In April 1973, Spilotro found himself back in Chicago under investigation for murder. Instead of a life of luxury on the Las Vegas Strip, Spilotro was facing life in jail. He had to find a way out. So first, Spilotro killed a co-defendant he thought might damage his defense. Someone he'd known for 15 years.
Regarding friendship in the outfit, can only go so far, and one has to follow orders if one's given orders to kill a friend. Friendship would have nothing to do with it in the long run. These aren't nice people.
But when on May the 30th, 1973, the murder trial began, another old friend, Chucky Grimaldi, gave evidence against him. The prosecuting attorney, James R. Meltrigger, clearly remembers Spilotro.
Spilotro's demeanor in the courtroom was very businesslike, professional, didn't show emotion, very well dressed, and presented a quiet image if you didn't know better.
Even when Grimaldi's eyewitness testimony shocked the jurors, Spilotro was unmoved.
When Chucky testified, his testimony involved grisly details. He was shot, he was stabbed, he was kicked and beaten, he was threatened with castration, pieces of his flesh were cut off. There was no sense of looking away, remorse, ghastliness at what was being said about a crime that Spilotro, was alleged to be involved in. No emotion at all.
Grimaldi's detailed testimony clearly condemned Spilotro. But then, Spilotro turned the tables on the prosecutor and the FBI. He told them something their informant had not. He had, he said, an alibi. Spilotro's brother, John, testified in court that they were together shopping in a furniture store at the time of the murder. Even though 10 years had passed, amazingly, the furniture store employees said they clearly remembered Tony Spilotro. The defense even produced a dated receipt to show to the jury. It seemed the Chicago outfit had protected their man in Vegas as only they knew how.
We could not break the alibi. We couldn't show it was recently fabricated.
The jury found Tony Spilotro not guilty.
I was relatively surprised, crushed actually. That kept the image, so to speak, that some of these individuals were untouchable. That was exasperating to a prosecutor.
Tony Spilotro was a free man. Free to go back to his life in Las Vegas. By 1976, Tony Spilotro was expanding his operation and opened a new jewelry store, the Gold Rush. He made it the center of his loan sharking, bookmaking, and jewelry fencing operations. To help him expand even more, he later called in his old childhood friend from Chicago, who had helped with the M&M murders, Frank Carlotta. Carlotta's job was to recruit experienced, skilled thieves from cities around the US and establish a first-class burglary crew. They made a real impact. Known as the Hole-in-the-Wall Gang, they left their signature all over town.
The Hole-in-the-Wall Gang got their name because they would punch holes in residential houses to get away from the alarm.
Spilotro was able to run his outfit with little risk of prosecution. His chief ally was fear. When the police or the FBI did get involved, they found a strange shortage of witnesses.
When someone comes by your house and says, we know where your children go to school, we know what your children do, either you cooperate with us or something could happen to your kids. That's the threats that they held over these people.
Fear was one persuader, money another. Local politicians relied on casinos for campaign donations. As some of those were owned or run by organized crime, many politicians were in effect working to preserve the status quo.
These people realized that their bread and butter was keeping these casinos running. And you couldn't blame them because it was the lifeline of Las Vegas.
Corruption was woven into the very fabric of Sin City, and this made stopping Spilotro an impossible task. The one organization that might have fought him, the Las Vegas FBI, was then just a small outpost. To make things harder, the FBI also faced corruption in the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department.
There was always tainted officers that were willing to accept monies from the mob.
They got perks out on the strip. They got jackets, gold bracelets, necklaces, and rings, and things like that, to look the other way or not look at all.
The FBI had another good reason not to trust the Metro Police. Confidential information was often leaked to mobsters.
Anything that we would give to Metro would eventually get back to Tony and his people.
So in 1977, the FBI realized that if they were to take on Spilotro alone, they would need more resources, including surveillance, electronic bugs, and telephone wiretaps. FBI surveillance expert Emmett Michaels was one of a draft of new agents sent to Las Vegas. As head of the technical surveillance squad, it was his job to target organized crime and find out what they were up to.
They used to use places like the Fremont. They used to use places like the Stardust to conduct their meetings. To put in a bug where you actually physically had to go into a room where they met took a lot of planning.
The hunters became like their prey, breaking and entering buildings at night, albeit with a court warrant. Not in a quest for cash or jewelry, but information.
It really requires an FBI agent to become a burglar, a good burglar, be able to enter premises surreptitiously, plant a bug or a wiretap, and then be able to monitor that wiretap and obtain evidence of criminal activity.
But with casinos operating 24 hours a day, a sly after-hours operation when people were asleep was often impossible. To put in a bug, the agents had to face their foe in broad daylight.
The only way to go in was to go in dressed as maintenance people and put the bug in while they were meeting. like they were working in the room. That way it didn't draw any attention.
To get electronic surveillance on Spilotro, the FBI also had to secretly penetrate his headquarters, the Gold Rush. This was no easier.
FBI agents had to physically climb up the telephone poles and do the connection. And while they were up there, one of them triggered the alarm. And the next thing you know, Metro responded to a break-in. Had Metro looked up the pole, they would have seen 4 agents up there on a pole, which they didn't do, so we lucked out.
Eventually, Agent Michael's men did succeed in getting Bugs into Spilotro's Gold Rush HQ. As they listened, their blood ran cold. They heard Detective Sergeant Joe Blasco and Sergeant Phil Leone of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police identify FBI surveillance cars for Spilotro. They gave Spilotro and his crew the names of undercover agents. They even named informants, putting their lives at risk. Although Blasco and Leone were fired and charged for their actions, the cases were dropped. Metro's reputation was left in tatters. But one man was determined to repair the damage. In 1978, a complacent Las Vegas was shaken to the core when Police Commander John McCarthy was elected sheriff on an anti-corruption ticket.
We got an honest sheriff. That set the stage for good law enforcement in Las Vegas forever.
Sheriff McCarthy completely reorganized the force, promoting a swathe of committed young officers over the heads of the old guard. At just 33, Kent Clifford was promoted to the rank of commander and put in charge of the Metro Police Intelligence Bureau.
My ultimate goal was to restore the integrity into the police department. It wasn't that they was all bad, they weren't, but the Bureau itself was tainted. And the only way I could clean it up was to clear everybody out, so I did.
While Metro Police Commander Clifford was preparing to bring down Spilotro in Las Vegas, the gangster also came under threat from a grand jury investigation in Washington, D.C. In 1979, Las Vegas crook Jerry Lisner confessed to the feds about his dealings with Carlotta and Spilotro. Lisner's testimony could lead to Spilotro facing trial and jail. Spilotro now applied the mob rule. Rats must be exterminated. He made sure he got the hit on Lisner authorized by Chicago and told Frank Carlotta to take care of it. Carlotta had no silencer for his gun, and to reduce noise, he decided to use half-charge ammunition. The hit did not go smoothly.
Frank Carlotta told me he shot Lisner, yes.
The half-charge bullets had little impact.
They were having a difficult time dispatching Mr. Lisner.
Carlotta emptied a second clip into Lisner's head. Jerry Lisner's body was found in his swimming pool. This most unprofessional of hits seemed to meet its aim, keeping Spilotro and Carlotta out of court and out of jail. But it was only a reprieve. This night's work would eventually be part of Tony Spilotro's undoing. Meanwhile, Commander Clifford was ready to turn the screw on Tony Spilotro.
We couldn't play by their rules. We couldn't go out and just shoot them and get it over with. We had to play by our rules. So we sat down and said, okay, what rules do we have?
Clifford decided to get under Tony Spilotro's skin, to force him to make a mistake. He made sure his officers were there when Spilotro or any of his crew stepped out of line.
When they got up in the morning, we followed them. When they made a left-hand turn and didn't signal, we called a uniformed cop and had them arrested and had the car towed. They had to bail out. That cost them money. That cost them at least $1,500. They had to go get their car out of hock. That cost them another $1,500. And it cost them inconvenience. And it made them mad. When they was mad, they couldn't think right.
Spilotro did now make a mistake. A very big mistake. After police shot dead an associate, Spilotro rashly issued a contract to kill the 2 Metro police officers involved. When Commander Clifford found out, he stormed off to Chicago to confront Spilotro's outfit bosses.
I knew that the Chicago bosses had never authorized a hit on a police officer. It was unheard of. They would never do that.
Organized crime has a rule. They do not seek retribution against law enforcement. Because if they do, then a great deal more pressure and attention is going to be brought upon them.
Clifford told Spilotro's bosses that if they broke the rule and came after his men, he would break another rule and go after their families.
If they kill my cops, I'm coming back out to Chicago with 40 men. I'm going to kill everything that moves, walks, or crawls around their house.
The prospect of being hunted down by a rogue policeman appalled the outfit's leaders, and they ordered Spilotro to cancel the unauthorized hit. Tony Spilotro was now in deep trouble. Not only had he failed to ask permission for a hit, but unforgivably, he put his boss's wives and children in mortal danger. Clifford had severely rattled Spilotro and damaged his position in the outfit. Spilotro was starting to crack. He demanded to meet Clifford, face to face.
We got nose to nose, Tony Spilotro and me. He said, you went to Chicago and told him you got 40 men. Well, I want you to know we got 400. I looked him in the eye and said, that makes us even, doesn't it? He said, what? I said, yeah, any one of my men are worth 10 of yours. And he backed up. He said, well, you said you was going to kill me. I said, I didn't say I was going to kill you. I said I was going to put you in prison, and I am.
To a beleaguered Tony Spilotro, the police were now a real threat. And the Las Vegas FBI was about to get tough too. The FBI director in Washington was about to send FBI legend Joe Yablonsky to head up the Las Vegas office.
As the director said to me, I hope you can stimulate some activity. And I do believe those words were met.
Joe Yablonsky was a famously aggressive investigator and successful prosecutor. Tough and unafraid, But in all his years, he'd never seen anything like the corruption in Las Vegas.
It was a place that was consumed by avarice and greed. My initial remark was, is this really part of the United States?
When he came here, he realized that he had to replant the American flag.
Until now, the Metro Police and the FBI had not cooperated. But they both now realized if they were ever to have a chance of jailing Spilotro, they would have to actively work together. What new FBI Chief Jablonski and Police Commander Clifford did next was unprecedented. They talked to each other.
I called him, said, let's go to lunch. So we went to lunch. He pledged cooperation. I pledged cooperation. So his men and my men got together out on the street. We had to earn their trust.
It was very important to have the cooperation of the Metro Police Department. I mean, they lived and grew up here. They had more informants on the street. You needed their assistance. You couldn't operate without it.
There wasn't anything we didn't share or we didn't try to cooperate with in our goal to rid the community of Tony Spilotro.
The FBI and the Metropolitan Police Department were of the same mind that it was now time to take decisive action against these people and go at it full bore.
Gradually, cooperation brought results.
Slowly, we were putting our puzzle together. Who the players were, what they were doing, how they was doing it, what hours of operation they worked, who their girlfriends were. We knew everything about them, except the color of their socks. We had a sense that we was circling the wagons, that we were bringing it in. We knew we had Tony Spilotro. It was just a matter of time.
Spilotro did not make it easy for them. He turned his Gold Rush jewelry store into a secure, fortified HQ. Guns were kept under the counter. He stationed men with binoculars on the roof as lookouts. He even had his own electronic surveillance and counterintelligence operation. Tony Spilotro thought he was invulnerable. But there was a weakness. The FBI had an informant, and Salvatore Romano was solid gold. He was the hole-in-the-wall gang's alarms expert. Romano revealed to the FBI Spilotro's elaborate plan for $1 million burglary on Bertha's Antiques and Jewelry store. More than that, he videoed their planning meetings inside the Gold Rush with a camera hidden in a loudspeaker.
The door itself is steel, and so that the steel will activate the magnet.
If the police and the FBI could catch the gang red-handed, Tony Spilotro was finished. The date for the raid was Independence Day, the 4th of July, 1981. Spilotro's plan was for the fireworks of the 4th of July celebrations to cover the noise of the gang breaking into Bertha's through the roof and into the vault. But police officers and FBI agents were waiting for them.
I was with Jablonski, and all my men had teamed up with an FBI agent. We watched it as it went down.
videotaping them when they showed up, and they carrying their acetylene torches and tanks and climbing up and getting ready to do their burglary.
Once the gang broke in, the agents and officers pounced.
We got the bad guys doing the bad thing, and we got all the equipment, we got all the evidence we'd ever need.
Among those arrested that night were crew boss Frank Carlotta and disgraced ex-cop Joe Blasco.
To see him show up there as part of that operation probably gave me some of the greatest joy in the world.
And I let him know how satisfied I was that I got to put him in prison.
The one person they didn't arrest that night was Tony Spilotro. But under new anti-organized crime laws, if they could connect Spilotro in any way to the burglary, he would face trial with his crew.
We knew that they worked for Tony. So absolutely it was significant at the time, tremendously significant. And it drew him right in to a major crime.
So it didn't matter whether he was there or not, we were going to get him. We were going to arrest him.
Spilotro's anxiety turned to paranoia. He was afraid members of the arrested gang might squeal and reveal not just his role in the robbery, but that Jerry Listner had been killed on his orders. Spilotro panicked and issued an unauthorized contract on the man who knew the most, his childhood buddy, Frank Carlotta.
We got word that Tony Spilotro had put a contract on him because he was suspect of becoming a witness, which he wasn't.
Ironically, until this point, Frank Carlotta had been following the Mafia code of omerta and keeping his mouth shut. But Tony Spilotro had left him no choice but to rat him out. The debriefing and protection of Frank Carlotta was assigned to FBI agent Dennis Arnoldy.
Certainly Frank Carlotta was scared what Tony Spilotro might do to Frank Carlotta after the arrest of Bertha, certainly. And once we told him that there was a hit on him, it was well-founded fear.
Frank Carlotta decided to accept the protection of the FBI and became a government witness against his associates. Spilotro had sealed his own fate.
Carlotta totally cooperated. There was no holdback. So that was a breakthrough from the standpoint of having someone directly connected to Spilotro.
During debriefing, Carlotta reached back 20 years into his past. He revealed it was Tony Spilotro who had committed the unsolved M&M murders. Spilotro was arrested in Las Vegas.
Now he faces extradition to Illinois and a Cook County grand jury indictment on murder and conspiracy charges in the deaths of two men whose badly beaten bodies were found in the trunk of a Pontiac in Chicago back in 1962.
In Chicago, on the 24th of October 1983, Spilotro went on trial for the double murder of Billy McCarthy and Jimmy Miraglia, 21 years earlier. Now, the FBI seemed to have Spilotro on the ropes at last. But the corrupting power of the Chicago outfit still reached into dark corners and high places. Some judges were rumored to remain tied to the mob, and Spilotro certainly seemed to think so. He persuaded his lawyer to agree to a tactic almost unheard of in a murder case. He waived his right to trial by jury. Judge Thomas J. Maloney alone would judge Spilotro. Maloney decided not to accept Carlotta's statements as reliable evidence. And so, he acquitted Spilotro. Judge Maloney was later convicted of racketeering, extortion, and obstruction of justice. He had taken bribes in 3 other cases. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Tony Spilotro may have escaped yet another murder charge, but it was only a short respite. This time, he was not untouchable. Law enforcement was finally ready for an all-out assault. He was hit with a triple whammy of charges. The FBI had painstakingly uncovered the mob's multi-million-dollar casino skimming racket. In the autumn of 1983, a total of 15 underworld figures, including Spilotro, were charged with fraud. Using Frank Carlotta's testimony, Spilotro and 17 others were charged with armed robbery and extortion.
Mr. Spilotro, anything to say?
But Carlotta had plenty to say. He enabled the Justice Department strike force to also charge Spilotro in connection with the murder of Jerry Lisner. Carlotta admitted to Agent Arnoldy that he had pulled the trigger and killed Jerry Lisner, but on Spilotro's orders.
Yes, Frank Carlotta told me he was acting under the orders of Tony Spilotro to kill Jerry Lisner.
3 federal cases were now aimed squarely at Tony Spilotro.
When the indictments started to come down, you knew that it wouldn't be long before Tony's reign would end.
Spilotro faced sentences that could total 85 years in prison. This prospect put him under enormous pressure, and the mob knew that people under pressure can crack.
He was an embarrassment. He was a loose cannon. All doubts have to be resolved in favor of the mob. It's possible he could say something that would hurt somebody.
The Chicago Mafia bosses hated the idea that anyone might squeal, let alone someone who knew as much as Spilotro. Two days before the hole-in-the-wall gang trial in Las Vegas, the outfit invited Tony Spilotro to return to Chicago. He and his brother Michael met up with people they knew and trusted. Associates, friends even. The brothers were taken to Bensonville, outside Chicago, believing that Michael was to be inducted as a made man into the outfit. But as soon as Spilotro entered the basement, he realized what was about to happen. He asked if he might say a prayer. Tony Spilotro had beaten and tortured many victims in his career. Now, he was forced to watch as his younger brother was struck again and again. Michael was beaten to death in front of him, and Tony Spilotro knew that he was next.
The bodies were buried one on top of the other. The first body was just about 3 feet from the surface.
The bodies were found just 8 days later on a farm in the neighboring state of Indiana, clad only in underwear.
When Tony Spilotro was killed, I certainly was not saddened by the event.
What condition were the bodies in? Can you describe that?
They were decomposing.
Well, that's a better sentence than the government could give them.
The forensic pathologist's report recorded blunt trauma to face, neck, and chest by fists or feet. The brothers were unrecognizable.
The identification was made as a result of a comparison with dental charts.
Tony Spilotro was dead, aged 48. The last unsolved murder of his career was his own.
They kill each other because they're thieves, and even though they're supposed to have honor among thieves, they don't. They cross each other. They start looking after themselves, and for one reason or another, they get killed. And this is a pattern that has existed since time immemorial with organized crime.
Tony Spilotro's death marked the end of an era in Sin City. The landmark cooperation between the police and the FBI changed not just the face, but the heart of Las Vegas. Soon the mob's ownership and control of the casinos was ended.
There was a unification of local law enforcement, state law enforcement, federal law enforcement, where they got together and basically kicked the mob out of Las Vegas for good. I can tell you today, it does not exist here.
Our goal was to put Tony Spilotro and all these thugs in prison for life. That's what we wanted to do. And the end results, because they died, our culture, our society was better off.
Now, later in life, I thought we've done a good deed for the city and for the country. And I think we're all should be proud of what we did.
On the 2nd of May, 1957, Frank Costello, head of the Luciano crime family, had enjoyed a dinner with friends in an East Side restaurant. He took a cab to his apartment, the Majestic, on the fashionable Upper West Side of New York's Central Park. As Costello entered the lobby, a large man stepped out of the shadows, raised his arm, and said, "This is for you, Frank." This organized hit on a top Mafia boss would signal the rise of the most dangerous gangster in America, Vito Genovese.
Vito Genovese was never anything but a homicidal maniac.
Probably the most despicable gangster
ever to run the streets of this city.
But Genovese's rise would also be a major turning point in the history of the Mafia. And his actions would bring down the full force of the FBI on the mob.
Are you going to have anything to say, Mr. Genovese?
Is it true that you're the head of the Mafia in this country?
It is not.
Vito Genovese arrived in New York from Naples when he was 15 years old and joined the thousands of other Italian immigrants to hit the city's shores at the turn of the century.
Genovese grew up in the slums of New York. From the beginning, he was involved in these terrifying street gangs. Violence ruled, and he never changed.
Genovese was a product of the gutter of New York City. He was constantly in conflict. Everything had to be out of the barrel of a gun. That was Genovese.
Police records show that over the next 10 years, Genovese was charged with shooting a man in Queens, running down and killing a man in Brooklyn, having a loaded revolver tucked into his belt on the Lower East Side, and murdering another hoodlum.
Vito Genovese, I'll give you a great example of what he did. He fell in love with a woman named Anna, who was married to someone else. Genovese and his thugs threw her husband off a roof so he could marry her, and he married her.
Murder was just a ritual with him. He had no conscience.
This appetite for killing did not go unnoticed. By the mid-1920s, Genovese was a hitman for the greatest mafia boss of them all, Charles Lucky Luciano.
Vito Genovese rose to the top by intimidation, and the guy who allowed him to do that was Lucky Luciano. Lucky Luciano used Vito Genovese as his intimidator.
Luciano may have looked very cultivated, but he needed hitmen. And when he needed hitmen, one of the first people he turned to was Vito Genovese.
By 1931, Genovese was acknowledged as Lucky Luciano's right-hand man and underboss, and was one of the key hitmen sent by Luciano to kill rival boss Giuseppe Masseria. Such was his reputation that Genovese was known as Don Vito, the Great Vito. And in 1936, Genovese got the chance to take the top job. When Mafia boss Luciano was convicted on prostitution charges and sent to prison for 50 years.
When Lucky was convicted and sentenced to a long prison term, Vito considered himself to be the heir apparent.
But things didn't go to plan. Genovese now also found himself being pursued.
Vito Genovese had been involved in a murder in the early 1930s and somehow had managed to beat the rap.
The victim had been one of Genovese's gangsters who had demanded too big a share of a crooked card game. Now an informer came forward and pointed the finger at Genovese as the man who had ordered the hit. Just as he was about to take control of the Luciano family, Genovese was forced to flee to Italy to escape the murder charge and the electric chair. With Genovese now out of the picture, Luciano sent word from his prison cell for Frank Costello to step in as boss. Just like Genovese, Frank Costello was born in Italy. He was 4 years old when he arrived in East Harlem with his parents in 1900. His father ran a grocery shop, and from an early age, Costello despised his humbleness. He loathed the way his father was willing to settle for a life of poverty. Costello chose the streets rather than work with his father and joined one of the violent gangs of New York. In 1915, Costello was arrested and sentenced to a year in jail for carrying a gun. But this event changed him and would make him a very different man to Genovese. On his release, Costello decided to use his brains, not bullets, to get ahead.
The people that he worked with were prone to violence, almost by definition, and he understood that murders were bad for business.
He would never be a kind of hitman, goon, a muscle man type. He was a gentleman gangster. He was never going to be a thug. And he also latched on to something called slot machines.
And by the 1930s, Frank Costello was known to the underworld as King of the Slots. His illegal one-armed bandit machines were grossing $500,000 a day.
He made millions. It established him as somebody who was known as an earner, not a guy who goes out and has to commit hits or violent crimes.
With Genovese gone, Frank Costello was a very powerful man. He was now the head of the New York Mafia, the largest mob family in America, with more than 400 soldiers beneath him. Costello easily filled Luciano's shoes and continued to add billions of dollars to the family's fortunes. Far away in Italy, Genovese was just trying to make his way. It is said that when he fled the US on the murder charge, he had $750,000 in his trunk. Genovese was going to need it. Benito Mussolini, the head of the National Fascist Party in Italy, was fiercely against the Sicilian Mafia. But Genovese would soon discover that he was open to offers.
Genovese cottoned up to Benito Mussolini by providing money, providing donations to fascist buildings, and he even managed to pull off a hit for Mussolini in New York. There was a newspaper which had been a persistent critic of Mussolini. He went to Don Vito Genovese, who got word to his killers in New York, and they murdered the editor.
As a reward for Genovese's donations and services, Mussolini gave him an Italian knighthood.
But of course, Mussolini was known for shooting mafiosos, and so he could never really relax.
When World War II began, Genovese seized another opportunity.
And he was a pretty crafty guy, Genovese. Turned out he worked both for the Axis and for the Allies.
When the Americans invaded Sicily in 1943, Mussolini was overthrown. So Genovese quickly switched sides and became an interpreter and advisor to the US military government.
They thought he was doing them a favor. What he was really doing, he was running a black marketeering scheme. He was stealing supplies from army bases by corrupting army officers and selling it on the black market in Italy.
But for all his Sicilian success, Genovese was still wanted for the card game killing, and the New York police had new evidence implicating him. A man called Peter Latempa had come forward, claiming he had heard Genovese planning the murder. He was now held in protective custody as chief witness against Genovese. The American authorities finally caught up with Genovese in Naples in August 1944. Genovese was brought back to New York to face the murder charge. But he had no intention of taking the rap. On the 16th of January, 1945, Latempa complained that he was suffering from a gallstone problem. He was given painkillers by his guards. Two hours later, he was dead. The toxicologist who had examined his body reported that he had been given enough sedatives to kill 8 horses. With Latempa out of the way, there was no case against Genovese. The judge told him, "I cannot speak for the jury, but I believe if there was a shred of corroborating evidence, you would have been condemned to the chair. By devious means, you have thwarted justice time and time again." Genovese was acquitted. Vito Genovese was back on the streets, but he was not the boss. The man in charge was still his old rival, Frank Costello, and he was thriving.
Frank Costello fashioned himself as a non-gangster. He fashioned himself as a businessman, sometimes bordering on aristocracy.
He mixed with politicians, congressmen, journalists, authors, judges, cops, and city councillors. With his connections, Costello developed a reputation as the boss who could bridge the legitimate world and the mob. The Salvation Army even made him their vice chairman. Genovese could only watch from the sidelines as Costello became a real New York player.
Genovese was intimidated by Costello's intelligence. He knew that Costello could get, with words, what he could only get out of a gun. And he was jealous of that.
Such was his power that before a judge could be appointed, it had to be cleared by Frank Costello.
He didn't just know judges and DAs and politicians, he bought them.
Potential mayoral candidates in the Democratic Party went to see him hat in hand, asking for his blessings.
He was an absolute corrupter.
When the Mafia gets control of your political and judicial system, when they're deciding what bills are passed, they're deciding how justice is meted out, then you're in danger. Frank Costello, even though he dressed well, looked civilized, looked cultivated, was one of the most dangerous mafiosi in American history.
Costello became known as the Prime Minister.
That title was given to him by the media. They made Frank Costello the American Winston Churchill in the underworld.
That doesn't mean he was boss of bosses. There was no such position. But as a prime minister is in most countries, he was the first among equals, and sometimes a little more equal than they were.
Genovese seemed to be out of it, but he realized that Costello was making a big mistake. He preferred to deal only with the big guys, but ignored the little guys.
Frank Costello neglected the troops. Frank Costello only concerned himself with the capos. And the capos is Italian for captain.
Members of crews that had been loyal complained. They had been neglected, that Costello didn't favor them.
Genovese saw this resentment as his opportunity to begin undermining Costello's leadership.
The soldiers, the button men in the family knew that Vito Genovese was the real deal, whereas Costello was a person who was a little out of touch. Vito Genovese never lost sight of the fact that he was a criminal, and Frank Costello lost sight of that fact. Frank Costello started to believe his own imagery, his own myth.
Everybody knew that Genovese wanted Frank's job, but he couldn't take the job. The other bosses wouldn't have allowed that as long as Frank was riding high. Frank had the connections. Genovese did not have the connections.
So what he does is he begins to make sure he's strong, that his rackets are beginning to produce money. So he has both money, and he has soldiers, and he has hitmen, in case there's a real showdown.
Now, Genovese was waiting and hoping Costello would make a wrong move. He wouldn't have to wait long. In 1950, an ambitious Democrat senator from Tennessee named Estes Kefauver headed a committee to investigate organized crime in America. Kefauver called on more than 600 gangsters, underworld figures, politicians, and policemen to testify before them. The country was transfixed as the hearings hit the headlines and television channels.
I remember the Kefauver investigations. I was a very young lad, and I remember actually watching those, and it was a real revelation. We began to see that there was these people among us, criminals, who were very well organized and very deliberate in their activities, and controlled a great deal of the criminal activity in this country.
Many of the witnesses refused to say anything, but not Frank Costello. He agreed to answer questions.
He thought he could go on the witness stand and come out as a gentleman, as a real businessman. And that he had this kind of outlook or outward appearance that he wouldn't look like a ruffian, like a hoodlum.
And Costello, billed as the most influential underworld leader in America, became the star attraction. But then, Costello made a miscalculation. He surprised everybody by insisting that his face shouldn't be shown on television, and the committee instructed the broadcasters to respect his request.
The television is not on any part of Mr. Costello.
The only option left open for the TV crews was to film his hands. And the subsequent images of Costello's testimony became known as the hand ballet. Whenever the questions about his criminal activities got too tough or too near the knuckle, Costello would rub his palms together, tighten his fingers, grip a glass of water, drum on the table in front of him, or crumple and tear pieces of paper. And although the television cameras were not allowed to show Costello's face, the newsreel cameras and press photographers had no such restrictions.
Mr. Costello is willing to face the camera and let you have a good look at Mr. Costello. As the photographer says to the little boy, can you smile a little bit?
Has this country come up to your anticipations? What have you ever done for your country as a good citizen?
Well, I don't know what you claim, what you mean by that.
Well, you're looking back over the years now to that time when you became a citizen, and we're now standing 20-odd years after that. You must have in your mind some things you've done that you can speak of to your credit as an American citizen. If so, what are they?
Paid my tax.
I pay my taxes. That was his answer. Now, in his mind, he thought that was enough. He didn't think that he had to join the Army or the Marine Corps. I pay my taxes. Everybody pays their taxes. They're working for their country. But he was the original superstar made by television.
Ridiculed and humiliated, Costello finally refused to answer any further questions and produced a note from his doctor.
A certificate of a doctor who examined Mr. Costello this morning.
All right. I'm in no condition to testify from here in until I'm well enough.
You refuse to testify further?
Absolutely. When I testify, I want to testify truthfully. And I can't, my mind don't function.
Costello had been publicly destroyed by the exposure, and he left the Kefauver Committee hearings as the Justice Department's #1 target.
Once he failed at Kefauver, everybody went after him. He was indicted for tax evasion. He was convicted. He was indicted for lying to Congress. When you are the prime minister, the man who can work the miracles, and all of a sudden you fall off your horse and fall on your face, you are not prime minister anymore.
Frank Costello paid the price of television. By him appearing in front of the Kefauver Committee hearing and it being televised, that was the beginning of the end of Frank Costello. In fact, that was the beginning of the end of the mob. It took many, many years, and Frank Costello was the beginning of it because it brought the attention of the general public to what the mob was actually doing.
But for one mobster, Costello's failure was good news. Vito Genovese. And he was going to make the most of it.
One of the things he does, he starts bumping off, killing Costello's hitmen.
The first on his list was one of Costello's top hitmen, William Willie Moore Moretti. Moretti had grown up with Costello in East Harlem and was now a feared New Jersey racketeer with his own army of 60 soldiers. He was also one of Costello's strongest supporters. But this planned execution wasn't just business. It was highly personal. Moretti had been promoted to Costello's underboss, his second in command. This meant that Genovese had been bumped down to just the captain of his old crew. Genovese had chosen his target well. Moretti was suffering from advanced syphilis, which was spreading to his brain. This had the worrying effect of freeing up his speech, and it was now feared that he would start talking to the press. Genovese used this to his advantage. Because of Moretti's condition, he approached the Commission, the Mafia's board of directors, and asked for their permission for a mercy killing. The Commission was set up by Lucky Luciano in 1931 as a democratic system for dealing with all the mob's affairs. It operated by strict rules. No boss could be hit without the Commission's permission. And they gave it to him. The hit would take place on the morning of the 5th of October, 1951, as ordinary New Yorkers went about their business. Genovese had now made it quite clear to Costello that he was coming after him, and Costello was in no position to fight back. He was locked in continual combat with the US authorities over contempt of court and failure to pay his taxes. Over the next 6 years, Costello was in and out of jail. When he came out on bail in March 1957, Genovese finally decided to strike.
Genovese many times tried to get the okay of the commission to kill Costello.
But the commission wouldn't give it. So Genovese decided to hit Costello anyway. Genovese now studied Costello's routine. The 66-year-old Costello took cabs or walked to his various meetings around the city like he'd always done, without the aid of bodyguards or bulletproof cars. It made him an easy target.
Other bosses had an army of bodyguards around them. Costello said if they're going to kill you, that's the first ones they'll bribe.
Genovese gave the contract to Vincent Gigante, who was a former prize fighter, who became Genovese's chauffeur. He was a real thug, tough guy. I mean, he'd kill you at the drop of a hat. He was the mirror image of a Genovese. Genovese liked him for that. He was just a ruthless killer.
On the evening of May the 2nd, 1957, Frank Costello enjoyed a dinner with some friends in an East Side restaurant. After the meal, he took a cab to his apartment.
Now, Costello lived in a very upscale apartment that overlooks Central Park. It was known as the Majestic Apartments. Costello was so sure of himself, even though he knew Genovese was around. And he came home one night, walked into his lobby, and he was met by Gigante.
Gigante raised his gun and yelled, "This is for you, Frank." Costello was covered with blood when he reached the Roosevelt Hospital. But the bullet had only shaved his skull. One of Genovese's top soldiers, Joe Valachi, later observed that Gigante had wasted a whole month practicing.
There's some debate on whether Gigante missed him on purpose or he just missed him out of ineptness. I choose the latter. He just missed him. But there's a rule in the mob. If you try and you miss, you don't try again.
The doorman of the Majestic identified Gigante as Costello's hitman. Gigante quickly gave himself up and was put on trial for attempted murder. This was a very dangerous time for Genovese. If Costello confirmed it was Gigante, police would come after him. But at the trial, Costello observed the Mafia rule of omerta, the code of silence, and told the jury that he didn't recognize Gigante. Gigante was acquitted, and as he left the court, he walked over to Costello, held out his hand, and said, "Thanks, Frank." Genovese knew that Costello alive posed a grave threat to him, and he heard that he was secretly meeting with the Lord High Executioner of Murder Incorporated, Albert Anastasia. Guns, ice picks, and strangling ropes were his stock in trade.
He was a tough, ruthless man, not at all like Costello, who was his good friend. If there had been a move against Costello with Anastasia still alive, there would have been a counterattack by Anastasia.
Genovese decided to strike first. The problem was getting to Anastasia. He lived in a New Jersey mansion, guarded by ferocious dogs and barbed wire fences, and always traveled with bodyguards. Genovese needed somebody on the inside, and he approached Carlo Gambino, then an ambitious Anastasia lieutenant, and convinced him they would both be better off with Anastasia dead. On the morning of October 25th, 1957, at 10:15 a.m., Albert Anastasia walked into a barber shop in Midtown Manhattan. His bodyguards parked the car in an underground garage and then took a walk. Anastasia closed his eyes and relaxed into the barber's chair. Two men in suits with scarves covering their lower faces walked up behind him. Anastasia was literally blasted out of the chair. Genovese now sprang into action. He immediately announced that he was the head of the family. And straight away, he turned on his old adversary, Frank Costello.
Costello knew what it meant. His time was over. His reign was complete. That if he didn't surrender or abdicate, he was going to be assassinated.
Genovese stripped Costello of all his gambling assets and interests in Las Vegas, Florida, the Caribbean, and New York. He only allowed Costello to live on the one condition that he get out and never be involved with the rackets again.
Costello sent a message to Vito Genovese, Don Vito, it's yours. You're in control.
Genovese had done it. He was now the boss of the largest mafia family in New York. But he was also in deep trouble. Blinded by ruthless ambition, he had ordered 2 hits on 2 mafia leaders without the okay from their governing body, the Commission. And he had done something else that some Commission members found uncomfortable. Genovese had also moved big time into drug dealing.
Genovese always thought that narcotics was a good deal for the mob.
Within the Luciano family, he was in charge of drug trafficking.
But Congress had recently passed tough new drug laws, and many mafia bosses were worried about the consequences.
Drugs brought heat. And what I mean by heat is that if you dealt drugs and you got bagged and you're facing a lot of time in jail, you're going to roll, you're going to become a rat.
Well, you could get up to 30 years in prison.
They felt that if they kept their hand on the drugs, they would be able to avoid that.
The Mafia heads around the country now feared that Genovese was a loose cannon who didn't play by the rules. And his drug trafficking operations could bring the FBI down on them. To save his skin, Genovese requested a meeting of the commission to explain his recent actions in New York.
The commission was not supposed to call another national convention, which will be held every 5 years for 4 more years. But Genovese insisted that the bosses from all the other families and the New York families had to assemble because of these important developments in New York, and he wanted it known that he was the boss of a family. So they picked the same place they had met the previous year. There had been a national convention in a small town in upstate New York known as Apalachin.
It would prove to be the biggest mistake of Genovese's life. On November the 14th, 1957, more than 60 senior Mafia bosses with their advisors and bodyguards traveled from Cuba, Italy, and from all over the United States to a hilltop estate in a small sleepy hamlet called Apalachin. 180 miles northwest of New York City and far from the prying eyes and surveillance of the city cops. Apalachin was the home of Mafia boss Joseph Barbera. His guests would include all the most powerful members of the Mafia, like Joe Bonanno, Carmine Galante, Sam Giancana, and Joe Profaci. And at the head of the table, Don Vito Genovese.
Apalachin Meeting was a meeting of mobsters from all over the country. Keep in mind that the mob, as we know it today, and as it was formed in 1931, was 100% controlled by the 5 families in New York. All the other cities were ancillary that answered to the New York mobsters.
But local detective Sergeant Edgar Croswell of the New York State Police had been watching the events.
The local police noticed something strange. All these out-of-towners and dozens of cars were pulling into one farmhouse in a remote area.
Croswell's suspicions had been aroused when he noticed that Barbera was booking up the local hotel. They'd also been tipped off by a local food supplier that Barbera had ordered 20 pounds of steak, 20 pounds of veal cutlets, and 15 pounds of cold cuts that day. Croswell had been keeping a close eye on Barbera, as he knew he had mob connections. He called for backup.
Well, we get the call, send as many people as you can to Apalachin. We have a thing going on.
Croswell ordered his troopers to surround the house.
We had a lot of people that they thought was the underworld, and we were to pick them up.
And when the guests got the news, there was blind panic. Some rushed to their cars. Others fled through the woods, ripping their silk suits against the brambles as they ran. Croswell sent his troopers in after them.
We saw one fella, he was standing on the back porch of a local house, but he wore a nice Homburg hat, and he had a nice overcoat with a fur collar. And we knew right away that he didn't fit in. We went in and took control of him and put him in the troop car with us.
Croswell and his men eventually managed to round up 60 Mafia members, including New York leaders Profaci, Bonanno, Galante, and Gambino.
Everybody had the same excuse that they heard Barbera was sick, and they all dropped in to see him, pay their respects.
Here you had this obvious convention of Italian or Sicilian American mobsters, and you couldn't dismiss it just as a casual meeting and the claim by all of them that they went to visit a sick friend. I mean, nobody could swallow that.
The Justice Department believed that at least 50 escaped, including Chicago boss Sam Giancana. Apalachin was the largest Mafia meeting ever rumbled by American police, and the mob would never hold one of this size again. Far from Genovese's triumphant moment announcing to the commission his ascension to the head of the Luciano crime family, he had exposed them all to the authorities. As a direct result of Apalachin, a federal grand jury found 20 Mafia members guilty of conspiracy to commit perjury and to obstruct justice, and imposed sentences of between 3 and 5 years. Eventually, these were overturned by the United States Court of Appeals on the basis of insufficient evidence. But the damage had been done. Genovese had awakened a sleeping giant. The FBI.
This is the FBI. The house is surrounded. Back out that door with your hands up. Never mind.
And it hit them like a bombshell.
I think the Apalachin organized crime meeting, the meeting of the bosses of America's organized crime in one location, really brought home to the American public and to the FBI the magnitude of this problem.
Up to this point, the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, had been reluctant to admit the existence of organized crime in America. He had even written, "There was no such thing as organized crime or the Mafia, and the claim that there was a national crime syndicate was baloney."
All of a sudden, everything that they had been saying, that there was no national organization, that crime was essentially local and it was up for local law enforcement to deal with, became obviously incorrect.
They were so brazen, they were so bold and so powerful that they would actually have a meeting, much as any large, legitimate American corporation would meet to decide internal issues, if you will, of their organization, their direction, what they wanted to do in the way of a legitimate company would do. This really imprinted itself on the American public and certainly on the FBI.
That was it for the FBI. I mean, if there was a moment where it was absolutely patently clear that they had a role to do that they had not been performing, that was it.
All this changed after Apalachin. The FBI were galvanized into action. Hoover immediately commissioned a special report to confirm whether the Mafia actually existed. It declared, "The truth of the matter is the available evidence makes it impossible to deny logically the existence of a criminal organization known as the Mafia, which for generations has plagued the law-abiding citizens of Sicily, Italy, and the United States."
After the Apalachin meeting, the intelligence gathering about organized crime became very much institutionalized inside the FBI. Most of the investigations were intelligence investigations, where we gathered information about who they were and the kinds of activities they were involved with.
As a direct result of the Apalachin raid, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics was instructed to target Vito Genovese in their fight against drugs.
Open up! When you close, come on!
What about the government's charge that you're the right man, that you're the #1 man in this narcotics business?
Charges are fantastic and ridiculous.
You think
That's what they are.
And have you ever known anyone in the narcotics racket? Have you known anyone?
I never did.
On April the 17th, 1959, the man who had gotten away with murder for so long was finally nailed in a Manhattan federal court. Don Vito Genovese was fined $20,000 and sentenced to 15 years in prison for masterminding an international narcotics syndicate that smuggled heroin and cocaine into the United States.
Never underestimate the menace that Vito Genovese left with even with his departure. It was he who was so instrumental, one of the key players in bringing in the scourge of heroin narcotics into America. Without him, it might never have occurred. He opened up these opportunities that the Mafia would use widespread distribution into the inner cities of America, the biggest cities, New York, Chicago. For the first time, you had the mass appeal of a narcotics contagion that enveloped the country. And one person who has to bear some of that responsibility is Don Vito Genovese.
Vito Genovese continued to rule his organization unchallenged from his prison cell. He died there on February the 14th, 1969, of a heart attack. His legacy was that he left behind the most powerful mafia organization in America that bears his name to this day. The Vito Genovese family continues to make millions from its criminal activities. But he left another, more damaging legacy to the mob. Genovese had exposed the Mafia to the FBI. The Apalachin disaster would signal the beginning of their crackdown on organized crime in America.